In this demo we're going to take a look at how to use the TEFA integration framework in conjunction with the Temenos custom adapters for the Fiorano ESB. We're going to start by looking at Integration Studio, which Temenos delivered in R12 both as an Eclipse plugin and also in Visual Studio for Microsoft clients. Within Eclipse we have an Integration Studio perspective, and here I've created a new T24 integration project which I've called T24. That's created 4 folders for me: events, flows, log and schemas, and I've then created a new event using the new T24 event wizard. The event editor is concerned with the exit point from T24, that is, when the event will be triggered and emitted. I have 3 options. I can emit when a particular version is used to commit a T24 contract, or I can select application, in which case regardless of the version used that application will always emit an event. And for R13 we have a third option, which is to emit an event linked to a component service. Each time a product team deliver a new component, it's automatically added to a service repository, and that repository is available to me in this design time environment. So I can select any of those services. So here we have payment enhancement service, which the banking framework team delivered in R12, and within that service I can select any of the available operations, and then whenever that component operation is invoked by T24, I'm saying I want a message to be emitted. But for the purposes of this demonstration we're going to stick to a straightforward funds transfer version. Funds transfer, new. Now for a version or an application we have a choice of 2 exit points. We can emit the message at the input stage of the contract or upon authorization, and we're going to select the input stage and then move to the flow tab. When we talk about a flow, we're referring to the format of the message which is going to leave T24 at runtime. Now I have a choice on this tab. I can either specify a new flow and click edit, or I can click browse and share an existing flow between multiple events. So I've created a flow here I've called funds transfer, which launched the flow editor, and the actual flow itself can be seen here in the flow folder. This scrollable list box has got all the fields retrieved from the standard selection record in T24. It's a mixture of fields which are taken directly from the funds transfer contract, but also enrichments which may be translations across one or more T24 tables. So there's an example. If I bring up the standard selection record, I created a J type called debit currency negotiable amount, where from the account number from the debit side of the FT I translated across to first the account record, picked up the currency for that account, and then translated across to the currency table. And that debit CCY field is available as an enrichment, and so if I select that as one of my fields on the flow, at runtime when I commit the contract, that enrichment will be resolved and included on the outward message. So I've double clicked a selection of fields from this list to build my flow enrichments, my outward message, and I've selected reference number, a few fields from the debit side of the transaction and a few fields from the credit side of the transaction. So having done that, I saved my flow, I saved my event, I then right clicked on my project and selected the menu option Integration Studio Publish, and my events and flows were published into the T24 flow catalogue. At that time a schema describing this message was constructed and returned to the design time, and I can see that in my schemas folder, and that's available to view in this editor, and you can see that that is a schema that includes the debit and the credit fields, and also some additional fields that we always include on every message that leaves T24, fields such as the company ID, the operator, the bank date and the stage the transaction is at. So when we talk about the flow catalogue in T24, we're talking about 2 tables. The first is IF exit points, which is keyed on the version or application to which our event is linked, and you can see the input stage, which is when we want the message emitted, the project name I created in Eclipse T24, and then the name of the flow, which was funds transfer. quite a simple table, and the second table that contains the contents of the flow itself is IF, Integration Flow Catalog. So here are all the fields that I selected as enrichments, and we automatically create an XML friendly name for those T24 field names. And then the last field on this table is the schema, which is the identical schema to the one we saw in Eclipse. So that schema resides both in T24, and it's also returned as a convenience to the design time. So let's now turn our attention to the design time from the middleware perspective. So here we're using the Fiorano eStudio, which is also an Eclipse based environment, and Fiorano uses the concept of event processes. It has a repository of those processes, and I've created a range of prototypes in this folder here. And key to the eStudio is the service palette over here, which provides a range of components. So it gives me FTP capabilities, email in and email out via SMTP. I have got database connectivity components. I've got a range of JMS and MQ components, and it's on here that we find the Temenos inbound and outbound custom adapters. So it's important to understand some terminology before we start. Whenever we refer to inbound and outbound, we're always talking about from the point of view of the ESB, from the middleware. So I've started this process by dragging the T24 inbound adapter onto this diagram, and this is the component that's going to receive the message that we just designed in Integration Studio, the message that is emitted when I commit a contract using the version funds transfer common U. The way to configure any Fiorano component is simply to double click it in situ. So if I show the configuration of the T24 inbound adapter, I've first specified how I'm going to connect to T24, which might be via TAF-C agent, it might be straight into TAF-J, or it might be via the component WSDL interface. I've specified the host and the port, the OFS source ID I'm going to use, and my credentials. Okay, the next phase is what we describe as the enterprise metadata discovery phase. So if I click on the browse button, at that point the component connects to T24 and it browses the flow catalog that we looked at earlier, and it shows me all the schemas that are available, that is all the messages that T24 is capable of emitting, and one of those is the message that we just designed, the T24 funds transfer. So I double click to select that message. So we now move on to look at the runtime connection details, which are going to be used after we deploy our event process. And again, I have a choice of TAF-C or TAF-J, and Fiorano has the concept of named configurations. So here I've set up a configuration for my development environment, which is the credentials I use in that environment, and I only need to do that once, and then I can reuse that named configuration for different instances of the component. And similarly, I've got some TAF-C connection properties, enable pooling, hosts, minimum pool size, and so on. So the last thing I need to do in the final page of the wizard is to specify the scheduling information, which is how often the adapter is going to poll the event table in T24 looking for messages which comply with the schema that I selected, the T24 funds transfer schema. I've selected an interval of 10 seconds for this demonstration. So having configured that, automatically associated with this output port on the adapter is the schema which we saw earlier on. The schema that describes the debit fields, the credit fields, and those additional fields that are automatically added onto the end of every event. So what I was then able to do was, from the transformation section, drag an XSLT component on, and if I double click to configure that, that allows me to perform a mapping between the T24 schema that's automatically been retrieved, which we can see on this side, debit account name, debit currency, debit amount, and a schema from an external system. I've got an example here that I just handcrafted, so it's called money transfer, and it's got the equivalent fields, the debit and the credit fields. I was then able to simply drag and drop from source to destination across the two schemas. This was obviously quite a simple example. If I've got more complex transformations to perform, then Fiorano provides a number of tools in the funclet view here, such as string conversions and lookup functions and maths functions and so on. So returning to my event process, after transforming the message into a different shape, I then used a CBR component from the flow section of the service palette, this component here, and if I double click on this component, you'll see that I created a couple of routing rules. One to say that this route is followed if the debit amount is less than $100,000, and to take an alternative route for amounts greater than 100,000. And those rules were also defined graphically, so I dragged the field I wanted to test against from the schema here, specified 100,000 and made the comparison. And as a consequence of defining those two rules, I got additional ports, output ports on this component. Now here I've made use of the display component, which is provided in the util section. This is a collection of components that's useful for development, testing and for demonstration purposes. So the display component will show us our message at the end of our event process, and another very useful one is the feeder component, which we can use to feed a message into the process. So an FT with an amount of less than 100,000 USD will simply be routed to this display component, and if the debit amount is greater than that value, we'll transform it using this component into a mail compatible format, and that will be sent out via the Fiorano SMTP component to a mail server. So all that's left to do now is to validate my event process by clicking on that button there, and that will perform some semantic checks, and once they've passed, I'll click on the play button, and that will actually deploy my event process into the Fiorano server. So I can now bring up this display pane here, and if I enter an FT, for 99,000 USD, accept those overrides, you'll see that within the 10-second polling window that message is immediately fed through and displayed in the format that I specified in my schema. So let's now generate a second contract for a value of greater than 100,000. $101,000. Okay, so this time no message is received by this component, so we've still got the one from before, but this time we do get an email giving us details of the transaction value. So a single event in T24 committing the FT contract has resulted in a single message leaving the system, and we've performed all our transformation of that message and the routing of that message outside of T24 in the middleware. So that was a simple example. Let's now take a look at a more complex event process, which is designed to illustrate the typical side effects of a financial event. So what we're simulating here is a single business event taking place in T24, resulting in a single message, and that message resulting in a notification to a payment gateway, to a back office system, a front office system, to risk, to a data warehouse, and also notifying the general ledger. So I've configured here an identical adapter to the first example, listening to the same events, but in this example I've chosen to make a number of web service calls using these components in order to enrich the message that leaves T24 and to build a superset of all the information that's required by the 6 external systems we just saw on the previous slide. So I'm using XSLT components to construct SOAP requests to feed into the web service, and also to take the SOAP response and build that at each step into the single message which ultimately I'm going to dispatch down each of these 6 routes. So we saw when we looked at Integration Studio that on the message that leaves T24 we can include quite complex enrichments which require translations across multiple T24 tables, and that's fully supported. But it's also acceptable to call back into T24 or to third-party systems, perhaps a customer MDM system, to add further enrichments of static data to that message before it's routed onward. We'll look in more detail later in the demonstration at the T24 Outbound Adapter, which is the ideal means by which to call back into T24. But here I've done an example using TWS web service calls, and also in order to illustrate another of the Fiorano components, I've introduced a database lookup with a trivial example where I have a table in a MySQL database which for any customer number I can retrieve a hat size. Before I started designing this event process, I created an XML schema and I associated that with what's called the application context. So this is the format of the message which I ultimately want to forward onto the external systems. So it includes the fields from the original message leaving T24 plus additional customer and account information which I'm going to collate from various sources. So I've already deployed this event process, and so I have a display window here which shows me the message which ultimately is going to arrive in this example at the payment gateway. So I'll now return to T24, put a further transaction through. And now within Fiorano in the display component I can see the message arriving at the payment gateway containing details about the debit and the credit side, but also with some further enrichment from the customer table, from the account table, and also in this case from my SQL database where I've retrieved the large hat size of this client. So let's take a look now at the T24 Outbound Adapter. So that's messages leaving the ESB and going into T24. If I double click this component here, we can see the configuration options that this adapter gives us. So again, we've got our connectivity details the same as before with the inbound adapter. We have a number of choices here. We can accept in single OFS messages or messages in a batch, same thing in OFSML format, and then here we're using the service XML. So this is custom XML which under the covers of the adapter will be converted into OFS and fed into T24. So again we have a metadata discovery phase. So if I browse into T24, if you're familiar with TWS, you'll recognise this as the service landscape, so the tree view that we typically see when we're creating a new web service. So this is a representation of all the schemas describing the applications, the versions and the inquiries that are exposed from T24. So in this example I've selected a schema for a version on the T24 Forex application, and I have an event process which is designed to read in a CSV, a comma separated value file, to translate that plain text into an XML format, and automatically by browsing to that Forex schema in T24 on the input port of this adapter I can see the schema that's been retrieved from T24, which is the same schema that would be used for TWS, which caters for multi-values, sub-values and everything you'd expect. So I've prepared this test file here which has just got details of 3 separate Forex deals, all for the same accounts but different transaction values, and I'm going to copy that into a folder which the adapter is polling at runtime, and the adapter will automatically pick up that file, process it and then move it to a separate processed folder. And therefore by looking at this display component we can see the message just before it's injected into T24. and here is that display window. So here we can see the 3 separate messages where the CSV file has been broken into 3, and we can see that the transaction value is different on each of those messages. So to conclude the demonstration, let's just have a quick look at the other capabilities of the Outbound Adapter. So on this event process, I'm just using single OFS mode, and I'm using the feeder component, so I can one of these utility components where I can just feed in OFS strings directly, and again a display component so I can see T24's response. So this is the feeder component, this is the associated display window. So if I open a pre-stored OFS command, here I'm using pre-authenticated mode so we don't see any password in the string. I'm using a different version here, and if I send that message I will immediately see T24's response come up in this window, and we can see that a contract ID has been allocated. And similarly in this second flow here, I'm using the Outbound Adapter with batch OFS mode. So in that case the feeder component allows me to use the request tag notation. So in a single round trip to T24, multiple deals will be injected, and in the third example I'm using OFSML, so same data but provided in an XML-like format. So that syntax is also supported. So that concludes our demonstration. We've had a look at codeless integration with T24, considering both inbound and outbound from the perspective of the ESB. At no point have we had to write any JBC code or attach a local routine to a version. We've understood that one business event in T24 is encapsulated in one transaction and results in one message leaving the system, and that all the transformation and the routing of those messages can now take place outside T24. The Fiorano custom adapters that we've looked at today are delivered as part of a wider enterprise stack strategy. So already in R12 we've delivered the BizTalk adapter for clients on the Microsoft platform. In R13 we'll see custom nodes for IBM WebSphere Message Broker. Similarly we're looking at Oracle Service Bus. But Fiorano will ship out of the box with T24, so it's the ideal choice for clients who haven't already got an incumbent ESB, or universal clients who are looking for a bank-in-a-box solution. If you would like to read more about the integration framework or any of the 6 frameworks delivered as a part of TEFA, then please visit our pages on T-Connect. We also have a number of active groups on Yammer, and we look forward to receiving your questions there.